Good evening to everyone in Hong Kong, and good morning to all our panelists who are dialing in from the United States. Tonight's talk is about China's increasing influence on Hollywood, how the country is wielding its soft power, and future trends. If you'd like to ask questions to our panelists during the talk, please send them to question@fcchk.org. That's question@fcchk.org. And do watch out for our other events, including one this time next week on Monday, featuring the diplomat Southeast Asia editor Sebastian Stranger. And now it is my distinct honor to introduce tonight's panelists. We have James Tager, the Deputy Director of Free Expression Research and Policy at PEN America. He is the principal author of the group's recent report, Made in Hollywood, Censored in Beijing. We also have Bethany Allen-Ebrahimian, China reporter at Axios. Before joining Axios, she was the lead reporter for the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists China Cables Project. She was also an editor and contributing reporter at Foreign Policy and national security reporter at the Daily Beast. And we also have Rebecca Davis, China bureau chief for Variety. She reports on the world's second largest movie market and burgeoning television industry. Formerly, she was a reporter with Agence France Presse, where she covered breaking news on topics ranging from politics to natural disasters, culture, and lifestyle. And to lead tonight's discussion, we have Shibani Mahtani. She is an FCC correspondent, board governor, and Hong Kong bureau chief for the Washington Post. So I take you to Shibani.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us this morning. I know it's early and I really appreciate all of you guys being here. So thanks so much. And since Christine has done a wonderful job introducing all of you, I'm just gonna get into it. I guess we can start perhaps with James talking a little bit about PEN America's recent report on precisely this topic, Hollywood censoring in China. In working on this report and sort of putting it together, what really sort of stood out to you the most? What did you find the most sort of surprising or glaring examples of censorship you've seen? And what are some of the more prominent ones that maybe has, evaded attention, compared to the more recent kind of Mulan film controversy? Obviously, this has been going on for a long time, and maybe you can talk through that with us a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much. As mentioned, we, PEN America, released a report on the subject August 5th. So almost 2 months ago now, basically doing our overview of the issue of Chinese governmental influence over Hollywood and is focusing on censorious influence or influence trying to kind of push a particular political narrative. Something that really stood out to me, but that was not surprising, but it did stand out to me, was just the number of people who were Hollywood insiders who were unwilling to speak on the record or under named attribution terms, right? It is representative of one of the biggest problems related to this issue, which is that Chinese governmental sort of censorship of Hollywood more and more looks like self-censorship, where it's Hollywood decision makers, industry insiders, et cetera, basically stopping themselves from pitching, a certain idea or certain content, certain dialogue, certain settings, from pitching it to Chinese government officials to even be reviewed and approved or not approved. And the idea is, let's remove all potential speed bumps out of the way. We had one interviewee who said, an analyst who said that Hollywood is increasingly savvy and increasingly paranoid when it comes to this. And, that's one of the most effective things about any censorship system in general, and including the Chinese governmental censorship system, which is it's remarkably effective at pushing people to self-censor rather than to potentially get in trouble. I can list specific movies that sort of came up for us, but I don't know if you want to keep moving. But, World War Z is an obvious example that we mentioned pretty significantly in our report, and that has been brought up in reporting on the subject, which is the idea that the source material for the movie, the book World War Z, identifies the source of their fictional virus as originating from China. And the book's author, Max Brooks, said he did this at least in part deliberately to make a comment on how epidemics are more likely to spread under a political censorship system. And that point was scrubbed by the studios for the movie release, which obviously contrasts really uncomfortably with where we are now, which is the idea that, well, if we cannot depict a fictional virus originating from China, what does it mean for our ability to discuss actual viruses, such as the coronavirus originating from China? And what does it mean for our ability to discuss the public health effects of political censorship, as one example? So that's one that stood out, but unfortunately there are many others throughout the report that were uncomfortable or surprising.
And just to continue there for a second, I know that the report touches on financial pressure as one of the main ones, obviously. But what other forms of pressure did you see, as part of this whole kind of censorship and battle for influence over Hollywood, other than the financial pressure exerted obviously by the Chinese market?
Sure. Well, I would say that Chinese regulators offer a carrot and a stick to Hollywood studios, determining essentially their stance on cooperation with Chinese governmental censorship. And the carrot is, well, if we really like your movie, we can offer better release dates. We can offer more preferential marketing buys for the movie. Essentially, we can create a more favorable regulatory climate for your movie to succeed. We can remove barriers out of your way. And the stick, of course, is, ultimately, if we don't like your movie, we won't show it within China. The largest sort of lever of pressure that the CCPA is able to push on is they are the sole gatekeeper to what is, as we speak, becoming the most important box office in the world. And access to or being shut out from that box office has massive effects for anyone Hollywood studio trying to maximize their bottom line. And the CCP has essentially used that as a point of leverage against content that they like is present in the movie, or at the very least that content that they dislike is absent from the movies that they allow within China.
Really interesting. Bethany, so I know you cover US-China tensions much more broadly, and with much bigger view to obviously everything that's happening in Washington right now. Maybe you can talk us through why Hollywood? I mean, why has this become such an important place to co-opt? Why is this soft power channel so important, and how does it complement, other ways that China is exerting influence more broadly in the US?
Well, if you look at Hollywood, there's almost no single more powerful, weapon, if you will, of soft power in the whole world. I mean, its reach is stunning, not just within the United States, but around the world. And an interesting sort of, comparative example here would be the Cold War. Now, certainly, one does not desire to have a Cold War going on. But it is certainly true that Hollywood had a massive effect on Americans and on the creation in our imagination of the Soviet Union as an enemy, or as bad, as evil, as incompetent, as unkind. And this is something that has carried on even up to today. I mean, if you look at, there's plenty of films from the past 30 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, after the fall of the Soviet Union, where even the hint of a Russian-sounding accent indicates that that character, is probably a villain. So it has this really powerful effect. And for the U.S. government, and let's be clear, this was not entirely organic. I mean, the U.S. government itself and the U.S. military has had an interesting relationship with Hollywood over the decades. But if you look at that kind of soft power tool, the Chinese government or the Chinese Communist Party has so clearly looked at that and said, oh, that's dangerous. Let's stop that. We do not want this powerful global platform being used to characterize us as bad, as evil, as incompetent, as inhumane. So at the very least, what they have very effectively done is to neuter that soft power tool. There's a phrase that the Chinese Communist Party uses, and this would be sort of more on the active side, the way that the Chinese Communist Party is more actively co-opting Hollywood to promote narratives that it approves of. And there's a phrase that's used within the party called borrowing a boat. So, you know, the party itself has tried to construct a global messaging power apparatus, if not a soft power apparatus, in the form of Xinhua, in the form of CGTN, its global broadcaster. But this is clunky stuff, you know, propaganda, highly censored, and it's especially ineffective in Western markets. So there's this idea that, well, if we can borrow a boat to go out on the ocean, if we can borrow someone else's platform and use that to spread our messages, that's more effective. And increasingly, that's what we're seeing with Hollywood. And I would say that they have been more active in that and more effective in that over the past 10 years or so. And it's in small little ways. I'll give a couple of examples. In the movie, is it Transformers 4? Is that the one in Hong Kong? Transformers 3, where the Chinese government, you know, there's a scene in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is being destroyed by bad guys, and the Chinese military comes in and is like, we'll save the day. You know, obviously a positive depiction of Chinese military power. There's another example, a small example would be an animated film, Abominable, in which very briefly there's a map of China, and it has the 9-dash line around the South China Sea, which represents China's rather spurious claims in that maritime region. So we're seeing, you know, an increase in these positive representations of China and of the Chinese Communist Party.
It was 4. I just double checked. You were right and I was wrong.
Okay, all right.
So Rebecca, obviously, you know, you cover much more closely the Chinese market and you know, what Chinese consumers actually want from their films. What has been the most interesting thing that, you know, you've written about and you've pointed out was how much of a flop Mulan was within, you know, Beijing, within mainland China, right? And so one of the things that I was hoping to glean more from you is what does the Chinese market actually want, and why is it that all of these efforts from Hollywood to really pander and to cater to them have actually not been particularly successful, particularly, you know, when we look at Mulan, right, which is obviously the most glaring and recent example?
Yeah, totally. It's a really interesting question, and one that I think Hollywood keeps obviously trying to crack and will not stop trying to crack, no matter how many you know, times Senator Ted Cruz tries to create a bill to stop this engagement. The Chinese market is probably going to surpass the US this year because of the coronavirus situation and how closed the US is as the largest film market in the world. And so this is an unavoidable reality that that American film companies are going to be trying to access those renminbis in people's pockets over in China. And so in terms of what people want, it's really interesting actually to see how Mulan, so these days Chinese audiences are getting increasingly sophisticated. If the film has bad word of mouth, if the ratings are bad within the first day, really, you know, your film's in trouble. And so it's very interesting to see how, since so many people are buying tickets online, like these days they're all like, it's become regulation because of coronavirus that you have to pre-book all your tickets online with real name registration. So there's a lot of really good data actually that these ticketing apps have on who's buying what, projections of how much box office is going to do that they can predict even from day one. Sorry, there's a bit of noise because at this hour I don't actually have a enclosed space in my apartment, so I apologize for that. So basically what people want is, it's really shifting over time. And so you had before, I think this era of, you know, it kind of exemplified by the kinds of propaganda films that they would do. You had like Founding of an Army, Founding of the Party, where you had a propaganda film, you just stuck a star in there, and then the idea was that Chinese audiences would flock to it because they really love Lu Han, or they really love this or that young Xiao Xianrou, this type of idol. And now we've really progressed to the point where actually you get some really surprising breakout hits that you really wouldn't expect. For instance, one of the top films at Cannes from a couple years ago, which was a Lebanese film about a young boy and his struggles, from Nadine Labaki, called Capernaum, which in the US made like a few $1 million, and in China it reached blockbuster status. So this is like an art house film in a foreign language about struggles in a foreign land, and this took off in China because people saw a story that was emotional, that they could really connect to, that really spoke to them. And so there's this potential in China, actually, that's sort of amazing and fascinating, that this could become, on some level, the largest market for weird art house titles or a lot of really diverse content. There is that appetite there, and it has financial legs. It's not just a one-off. You've seen a couple other of these sort of smaller art house things that in the US nobody really pays attention to because we're not used to listening to films in foreign languages still, because we're Americans. Really doing very well in China, where people are, of course, used to consuming foreign content and reading things with subtitles. So an increasing sophistication. You can't just stick, Fan Bingbing in your film for 2 minutes and then expect people to flock to it like it's a Chinese film and feel really proud about that. People are, beyond that stage now. But also, a real sense of national pride that is not, purely top down. There's, of course, those top down films that come out every year that, there's still that practice of like kind of encouraging those films to do better, whether that's by literally encouraging people at SOEs to buy tickets and go, or, just giving it better release windows, longer release windows. Most films only get a month in theaters. If you do really well, you get 2 months, both Chinese and foreign. But then if you're a Chinese film that they really want to promote, for instance, last year's My People, My Country, or My Country, My People, I can never get it right in English, 我和我的祖国, which was last National Day's big hit, that got to stay in theaters for, like 6 months. So of course the box office, when you look at it, it cracked, the top 15 highest grossers of all time, because it just had more opportunities than, say, Avengers, and I'm sure if Avengers had the same opportunity to be in theaters for 6 months with lots of promotion on that level, it probably would have done much better. So there remain sort of market constraints to really understanding exactly what would be such a breakout hit in China, right? Like if Avengers, which took over the China market, and Avengers Endgame at, an unimaginable rate, like if you basically wanted to go to a movie in theaters during its first few weeks in theaters, there was nothing else to see. 98% of everything scheduled was just screenings of Avengers. So, you wouldn't get that in another market, really. But that sort of goes to show the extent to which the protectionism really serves a purpose, and B, that it's hard to kind of know exactly what in a totally open environment people would like. But when it comes to, again, the sort of Hollywood catering to China and trying to create products that it thinks people are going to like, I think with Mulan, we really see an example of them trying their very hardest to create something they thought would resonate, whether that was taking out the songs because Chinese audiences historically haven't flocked to musicals, whether that was really trying to be more historically accurate and make it more of like a wuxia genre thing, whether that was casting an actress that the Chinese market really loves and thinks is, an exemplar of classical beauty, and they find Liu Yifei very appealing, although there's sort of contentions around her acting prowess, I guess, historically on the Chinese web. But, she was clearly a popular figure. And so you have all those coming together, yet creating this sort of Franken film where, it's still filtered through the minds of American creators who've taken their creative liberties in a certain direction. And, and the end result is kind of something that the Chinese audiences feel, although it's catered to them in a way, they feel like, what is this? It doesn't feel familiar. It feels inauthentic. Everything from that, my favorite example of something that I didn't really find that problematic, but I saw mentioned numerous times in Chinese reviews, which I thought was interesting, that sort of crystallizes this. So Disney said that, we really tried to go back to the ballad and make this more historically accurate. So there is a famous line at the end of the ballad that's very cryptic about how it's like a metaphor about how two rabbits running in a field next to each other, as they're running, it's hard to tell what gender they are, as like a metaphor for kind of like gender parity or something. And actually, so they put this moment into the film, not a spoiler here, where Mulan, when she's a young girl, she's riding her horse through the field and she sees two rabbits running along, and she comes home and she says, "Mom, I just saw two rabbits in the field and it was so hard. You couldn't even tell which was male and which was female," which is almost a direct it was a literalization of that last line in the poem, and clearly was put in there as a nod to the fact that most Chinese viewers would know that line, which is a popular Chengyu. And instead, Chinese viewers thought that like this moment was so ridiculous, they found it, you know, very strange to be literalizing that in this way, and they found it sort of, you know, a joke and an example of this forced East-West fusion that, you know, felt very inauthentic to them, even though, you know, that was kind of a little Easter egg for people. So yeah, I don't know, I think it's very hard, and we haven't quite cracked the code, but, you know, one thing that probably would help is having more, you know, all the writers on this project were non-Chinese. A lot of the creative teams were, you know, not people at the top of their game, clearly, but not, you know, as versed in Chinese culture. And, you know, probably that's something to think about. And I'll stop there, but there's so much more to say, I think, on how to create something that could really resonate in both markets.
And just to go back to Bethany for a second on the topic of Mulan, just because I know you've written about it quite a bit. You know, it did seem like that was a very, very stock example to American viewers and to American, you know, politicians, senators, whatever, of this idea that Hollywood was so blatantly trying to pander, you know, so blatantly doing things that, you know, by due diligence and human rights standards, you know, would not be acceptable really for an American company. Do you feel like the conversation around that was a little bit different than some of the other films that came before it? And what do you think was so jarring or so kind of shocking about the way, you know, this whole Mulan thing was handled, and also, you know, released, and the pandemic and everything else? I mean, and this moment obviously in US, China. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So for viewers who aren't familiar, the really big controversy around Mulan in the US right when it was released was actually had nothing to do with the storyline or the, you know, plot or any of that. It was that in the credits, you know, the movie thanks several different party and government entities in Xinjiang, which is, you know, a region in China where the Chinese government is currently committing a cultural and demographic genocide. And so the movie in the credits thanks the Xinjiang regional propaganda, like the party propaganda office. It thanks the Turpan regional municipal security bureau, which is now, as of 2020, actually on a US government sanctions list for being directly complicit in the operation of concentration camps. So it was just shocking, you know, to see. So Jeanette Ng, who was writing about the film, she was going to write a review of it. She's the one who kind of broke the story on this, took a screenshot of the credits and put it on Twitter, and it just exploded. And it was, I think it landed, it would have been bad no matter what. But it landed in this, you know, in the midst of this controversy, which is basically more or less about how Americans, powerful, rich Americans, and, you know, a powerful American corporation have sold out any semblance of values to the Chinese Communist Party. And this was such an extreme example of that they're thanking, you know, entities that are complicit in genocide. You know, a couple of possibilities here, and we don't know because Disney has not been forthcoming about this, you know, which is again just more of the same example of you know, we feel that they're just refusing to tell the truth. But we don't know if that they were asked to put that in there, you know, to make Xinjiang look better, to kind of whitewash Xinjiang, or if whoever was in charge of this was so removed from all these debates and issues about human rights in China that they didn't even realize, you know, what it would do. And so that was kind of a unique thing for Mulan, but it wasn't the first controversy that's happened with Mulan that didn't really have to do with the actual plot or script. And the first one was last year when Liu Yifei, the Chinese star, posted on Weibo, which is, you know, Chinese social media, in support of the Hong Kong police and against the Hong Kong protesters. And that also falls into kind of this, you know, two different environments. You know, maybe she feels that way. It's probable that she does. Many Chinese people feel that way, but also the Chinese government has been very good at co-opting celebrities in China. You know, they cannot they cannot criticize the party or else they will be blacklisted. Preferably, they must support the party in that way. So that post of hers, was likely influenced in some way by that. But in the U.S. then, and in Hong Kong, of course, that's when you started seeing hashtags on Twitter, boycott Mulan. So you have these two big incidents that shows that Disney, either they are really inept at trying to deal with the need to be in the Chinese market, but the problematic nature of the way that the party has weaponized that market and has demanded a sort of like behavioral political loyalty from the people trying to get rich from that market, and the need to have a basic democratic morality. And Disney has really, just absolutely failed at that. We do not see them in any way trying to meet to hold up some kind of support for these important human rights questions of our time. Maybe they are, but if they are, they're doing it behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm. And James, just, you work for an organization that obviously is so closely intertwined with, the right to free expression, holding up sort of First Amendment rights and so on in the US. How do you see what's happening in Hollywood sort of fitting into the broader patterns of censorship and, China sort of trying to co-opt the narrative and influence so many of these American institutions, right, that have for so long been quite defining for the American psyche? I mean, the NBA is another one that comes to mind. Obviously had some issues around the Hong Kong protests last year as well. And do you envision more of this to come? Hollywood, NBA, perhaps more, right?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that's right. I think it's important to start with a little bit of the context in acknowledging that, our report and this conversation right now is occurring during a time of increased US-China rivalry. And we are seeing proposals in the United States. Rebecca referenced one briefly, which is Ted Cruz's proposed Script Act. We're seeing we're seeing both rhetoric and proposed action from US officials on this issue. And in part, that was one of the reasons we wanted to wade into this conversation this year, in part to say, well, listen, let's make sure not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And the response from any U.S. policymaker should not and cannot be, imposing government restrictions on Hollywood content in the name of saving us from a foreign government's restrictions on Hollywood content. And so, part of this is just the framing issue of making sure that we frame this not as a U.S.-China issue, but about safeguarding freedom of expression for artists, in this case, filmmakers, from undue government influence anywhere. And as you referenced, we're certainly seeing, we conclude, that Hollywood is one aspect of this sort of exportation of Chinese censorious pressure. And it's definitely related to Bethany's reference axiom of borrowing a boat to go out to the ocean. Here, the idea that if you are, say, a multinational corporation, or if you are a major scholastic or academic institution, that you are increasingly kind of guarding your own speech and the speech of those affiliated with you to sort of not upset foreign governments. And in this situation, we're referring to Beijing. So that exportation of censorship and the concern about having large institutions, including Hollywood, sort of build down their expression to the lowest common denominator of whatever pleases Beijing is really problematic. You mentioned NBA. There have been examples in the video game world. There have been examples in with large corporations needing to remove reference to, say, Taiwan from even just their drop-down menus. These are illustrations in different industries. If I could actually mention one thing that has been kind of kicking around my brain with the Mulan example, that's somewhat related. We, in our report, one of the more complex issues we wanted to jump into was for people who are worried about diverse representation in Hollywood and making sure that there are truly global themes, and making sure that, when it comes to resisting censorious pressure from Beijing, that we're not, again, to reutilize the phrase "throw the baby out with the bathwater," which is to say not to throw the good out with the bad, and make sure that we're simultaneously, not falling on, say, reductive tropes of representing Asians or Asian Americans when we're making films, and recognizing that both of these things are essential goods, but in some ways they're connected. I've been thinking about the Mulan example and the fact that they filmed in Xinjiang, while at the same time, all the press about the Mulan example would use phrases like, army of Chinese cultural consultants and extensive conversations with Chinese officials. And it's like, well, either none of these army of Chinese cultural consultants caught that it was not a good idea on moral or practical levels to film in Xinjiang, or they did mention it and that advice was overridden. And it's certainly kind of, in my mind, again, although that's on some level speculative because I don't know what the conversations were internally, but in my mind, it illustrates how this sort of this cultural, what Disney was kind of pushing forward as a cultural communication really does seem to be more of a political communication, because they missed one of the biggest sort of the biggest ways they could go wrong. And I think it's illustrative of the way that, of the problems that are caused when a government entity, in this situation, the CCP and its regulatory censorship institutions, insert themselves into conversations about how to make cross-cultural films.
Yeah, and I think that diversity point is actually, really interesting. Rebecca, I'm going to try to frame this question in a way that actually makes sense. But something that I was thinking about as James was talking was that Hollywood has obviously been making strides in trying to diversify, trying to express different people's experiences, right? Asian Americans, Indian Americans, African Americans, LGBT, and so on and so forth. Do you think that there is some conflating here, though, of the Asian American experience and what the Chinese market could possibly want, right? And do you think that is something that is a gap, right? That hasn't really been sort of bridged, because obviously the experience of China, as you mentioned, right, is something quite different, from the Asian American experience, and what they've responded to, like the film that you mentioned with the Lebanese boy, seems to fit more within the category of what the Chinese experience is, rather than what America perceives China and Chinese people to be, right? Does that make sense? I hope so.
Totally, yeah. Actually, I'm working on a piece that's going to be out in the magazine next week or the week after about this very issue, sort of looking at the Asian American response to Mulan and how awkward of a place this is. So Mulan initially, you had to remember where we started, which was just even concerns that they would whitewash the casting and cast, like a Scarlett Johansson as Mulan. There were even rumors at the time that maybe that was in the cards, right? So we've come a long way, at least, to having an all-Asian cast in front of the camera. Again, not necessarily with Asian talent behind the camera in all those key creative roles, but at least in front of the camera, we have Asian faces. And so this is still rare in Hollywood. It's still so rare. And, we have this increasing wave of, from Crazy Rich Asians to The Farewell and the warm critical reception it received in the US. Although, again, these two films, not in China, resonating with Chinese mainland audiences. To now Mulan. And so there is this, uptick that, Asian American creators, talent in Hollywood really want to see continue, whether that's by, organized, there's, an organization that fights for Asian representation with the hashtag Gold Open. So the idea that if there's an Asian film out there, whether that's Parasite, which is technically Korean and doesn't have anything to do with Asian America, or whether that's Crazy Rich Asians, we're going to hashtag Gold Open, and we're going to support the heck out of this film and make sure that its opening days, its opening weekend is financially awesome. Because in Hollywood, there's, I forget whose line this is, but the idea that Hollywood doesn't see color, they just see green. So if your film does well, you'll get more of that same product, because it's all sort of this, machine of comparators and what came before and projections. Making a film is inherently a very risky enterprise. So if you could do a sequel to something that will do at least this well, obviously you're going to go with the safer bet. So if there's a history of films with all Asian casts doing very well, you're going to have more likelihood in future of those projects getting greenlit at that scale. that have an all Asian cast. So this was sort of hailed in the West as, you know, a real landmark representation. This is the most expensive film ever made by a female director. She was very, you know, adamant also about having a lot of the key positions being women behind the camera as well. So, you know, it was trying to be woke, quote unquote, in US parlance. So I think so where it gets very interesting is that, yeah, then the whole China politics issue gets accidentally injected into this film, whether that was through both Donnie Yen and Liu Yifei's comments about Hong Kong in the past. They've also expounded on the South China Sea issue in the past as well. So these are two stars that, for their own careers and their own trajectories in mainland China, have to or want to toe a certain Communist Party line. You know, so you have with the Xinjiang issue, with the, you know, the support of the Hong Kong police, you have these external forces coming in that are very different from the average American conversation around representation, which is just no Asian faces, spend money, tell the studios we like it, more Asian faces, hopefully. So there's this more sort of insular, maybe provincial in a way. I mean, coming from an international perspective, it's been interesting for me to talk to Asian Americans and ask, you know, how did it feel to watch this film and watch this out of this, what should have been a celebration, especially for a lot of the up and coming Asian talent in the film, which should have been celebrated wholeheartedly by their sort of small and tight-knit community of, you know, Asians in Hollywood, has spun out into this very awkward thing where to celebrate it is basically to be complicit in genocide, kind of, by implication. And so that's a very strange position. And a lot of people telling me, like, yeah, if I had known that that was the case, maybe I wouldn't have supported this film as aggressively as I did in its opening days, or what have you. But again, I think Asian Americans being in the most awkward position in a way of all ethnic minorities, you know, hybrid folks in the US, because they're the only ones with ties back to a motherland, really, China, that has this market influence, that has the economic clout to really shift the dial on what Hollywood is doing. Like maybe someday India, I don't know, but, you know, if you're from, you know, Indonesia or something, it's not that Hollywood is catering to something that will drown out the voices of Indonesian Americans advocating for something in America, right? Like if you're from a different place, you know, there isn't a whole huge, world's most populous country's worth of people who have a very different aesthetic taste, a very different politics from you, who are going to ultimately sway things more than any amount of Asian American organizing can do in the States in terms of what kind of representation they hope to see. If it's a choice between Asian America and China, you know, one of those speaks more loudly in that green that is so essential. And so, yeah, I think, you know, it's a real shame, and it's a discredit to the Asian American talent and the Asian talent that, you know, it's a shame that this film, this particular, what should have been a celebration, you know, the only quote unquote Disney princess who is Chinese, ended up, you know, turning out in this manner. And again, asterisk, she's not Han Chinese necessarily, and that's probably a whole nother topic about, you know, how the Mulan of legend has been sinified over the years from being someone who was probably initially Muklan, someone of the Xianbei, semi-nomadic peoples, an ancestor to the Mongols, then having that sort of oral tradition written down in the ballad and then transmitted over centuries to become the Mulan that we see, say, and popularized in the animated Disney, let alone this version of the Disney story, where you have, I think, to me, the most egregious bit, this is sort of off topic, but the most egregious bit of the politics is not just the fact that it was filmed in Xinjiang, but that the story itself is one in which the sedentary empire is equated with the modern Chinese Han ethno-state. And the bad guys, they're no longer the Huns of the animated version, but they're now the Roran people, which is supposed to be more historically accurate, but it's sort of just a surface level of accuracy, really, when the Roran people, who, you know, are the nomadic people, are portrayed as the evil, you know, the indisputably bad guys, and they're filming it in Xinjiang at a time of ethnic repression. So really, it's the text of the film itself also makes the politics all the more awkward, because it's about basically the sedentary empire having the right to conquer the Xinjiang region, which is an awkward look at a time when also there is unprecedented there's been unprecedented protests from ethnic Mongolian groups in China, and to see Mulan, who was probably Mongolian, some ancestral people of Mongolia herself, as a heroine putting down these sort of nomadic invasions is very strange. So the politics, the modern Chinese politics mapped onto the representations of ethnic minority peoples in the film is also a very strange fit.
For sure. So I'm going to ask one last kind of open-ended question, whichever of you wants to answer it can. Do you think Hollywood has learned anything from this experience with Mulan, and do you think it will actually lead to any kind of soul searching or make them kind of change the way they approach this stuff in future, or do we think that's not really going to happen? I'll let whoever wants to answer it answer that, and then for anybody in the audience who wants to ask questions, please do so, and we'll get to you. Thank you.
Can I jump in with that? No, I don't think. I think the main lesson that Hollywood has learned, and this is going to be the same lesson that we see many other multinational corporations learn, is get better at hiding things. So my guess is that in the future, if they film in Xinjiang, well, they're probably not. Maybe they're not going to film in Xinjiang. I don't know, but if they do, they're definitely not going to thank it in their credits. So what we see. When you have this kind of censorship or self-censorship, or some American company or international company has jumped in with both feet, they're like, we want the Chinese market and we're fine with censoring. After they get called out on it, they get better at it. They send out memos to their employees being like, imposing what I'd like to call a no controversies policy, like, oh, we don't comment on politics. We don't get involved in politics. And you see the spread of these kinds of no controversies policies, which is censorship. That's just another way of putting censorship. So Hollywood, I do not think has learned. They're going to continue to censor themselves to please the Chinese market. And they're just going to try to get better at, while censoring themselves, not angering an American audience. That's it.
James is nodding. Do you want to add in?
I mean, Bethany's touched upon something that I think is so crucial to how we would ever address this issue, which is, for example, if you look at the Sony hacks, which revealed a lot about how Sony executives were discussing this phenomenon. And if I recall correctly, one of the conversations about whether to cut a small scene in the movie Pixel about Pac-Man smashing through the Great Wall, they were discussing whether they should cut it for the Chinese release or the global release. And if I recall correctly, the decision was remove it for the global release so that no one can say, oh wow, you only removed it for the Chinese release. And so this is an example of the type of pressure where, in order to make sure that this capitulation is less visible, companies will increasingly sort of censor the global release, preemptively self-censor the global release of a film so that it will not come up or potentially be discovered when they go through the Chinese regulatory process having the movie approved for China. One of our report's biggest recommendations was, we recommended that Hollywood as an industry unify and create a disclosure mechanism, disclosing where they've received censorship requests from anywhere in the world, not just Beijing, not just Washington DC, but anywhere in the world. One of the critiques of that recommendation, and we try to grapple with it in the report, and I think it is something that has to be seriously thought through, is, well, will this just increase the pressure on studios to self-censor even earlier in the process before anyone can get them any requests, because their goal is to essentially make sure to reduce all potential reputational costs. And that's something we should be really clear-eyed about. And when we frame, when we figure out how to quote unquote solve this issue, that's something we really have to keep in mind, in making sure we don't create incentives that actually act perversely and push studios into self-censoring themselves even earlier in the process.
Yeah, I would jump in just with a small counterpoint that, censorship, self-censorship is obviously bad, and I do really think that if anything, the Mulan example just shows the importance of, how having a diverse team in the development process coming up with these stories. And you could see that as in the worst case scenario, yes, that's just better self-censorship, doing it early in development so that you don't run into these pitfalls. In a positive light, that could also be having, if you're going to try and make a film that appeals to China, having Chinese people in that room so that you can have more nuanced characters that read more authentic, that are exciting to people worldwide because they feel like more human characters than, say, Gong Li's witch or Bori Khan, the bad nomadic man. That the upside could be a more sophisticated product that has better representation, that rings true on both sides. It's really hard. I haven't seen anyone crack it yet, and I think given the current political environment, we're not going to see a lot of these co-production. There's not really going to be US-China co-productions in the pipeline, but the upside could be, from the Mulan moment, could be an acknowledgement of, yeah, if we're going to do this type of thing, which we totally should have Mulan films. We should have films that draw from Chinese culture, from Indian culture, from whatever culture, right? In Hollywood, we should have more of that. And so how can we do it better? And maybe this can be part of a wake-up call on what better looks like. That would be my hope. And I don't think that's too super far-fetched, for all that there aren't going to be co-productions going forward, which previously have been very crude collaborations where you kind of stick an American character and a Chinese character together and they fight a shark or something, right? Maybe we're going to see more, this could push for more sophisticated dealings with Chinese culture, American culture, ways to fuse the two. It doesn't have to be political, right? Not everything has to be political. It could be just The Farewell, right? Which was a beautiful family story that was told by someone with deep sensitivities to both sides. Again, still didn't resonate in China because I think people saw it as too American. So, it's hard to strike the right balance, and no one really has yet of something that is drawing from both China and the US, yet really works in both markets, except maybe like Kung Fu Panda, which everyone loves, and which, Chinese people see Kung Fu Panda and they see an American panda. It's just Jack Black as a panda, right? But they still love it, and the attention to some cultural detail in that was really appreciated there. I think we'll just have to find new ways of continuing to make. We shouldn't, I just feel like sometimes the conversation in the States these days, with all these, especially GOP senators, pounding their podium and saying, Hollywood censorship, it's bad. Yes, it's definitely bad. But the opposite, which is just a total disengagement and everyone kind of going their own way, I think is also, would be a human tragedy. It would be sad. And, it maybe doesn't lead to the best art at the moment, but I think there is something idealistic about film as, a powerful narrative medium that, we should still keep trying, right? It's not about totally shutting that door. It's about finding maybe better, more moral, more transparent ways of working together. And so, for instance, I guess the next big example is going to be Netflix is adapting Liu Cixin's Santi series, the Three Body Problem sci-fi series. And it's going to be done by the guys who created the Game of Thrones TV show. So there's a lot riding on that, and it's already been the subject of US senators decrying it for the fact that its creator, Liu Cixin, the Chinese sci-fi author, has, very party line views on the Xinjiang issue. But at the same time, does that mean we don't create this series that, fleshes out the world envisioned by a Chinese creator? Is the answer then that we just don't make an adaptation of this sprawling novel that, Obama said was one of his favorite novels a few years back, and, has really sparked the imaginations of millions of people worldwide? I don't know. It's debatable, right? But I guess as I see the direction that China's industry goes, which is, especially in the coming year, next year is the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party. And so there's going to be a bevy of very nationalistic films. All the big titles are going to be very 正能量, very positive energy, very lauding the party and so on. It's all going to be content that doesn't play well anywhere else in the world. No Americans except for anthropological interest are going to be watching this stuff really. And so I guess I wouldn't want to see a world in which our two markets culturally decouple to the point where everyone's just watching their own stuff and there's no dialogue even in the sphere of art. I think that would be a scary world.
Great. I'm just going to get to questions really quickly. There's a quick follow-up for you, Rebecca. Is China even capable of transparent, better engagement, with Hollywood right now? I mean, do you think that that's sort of possible?
No, no. But I think it's fair on the American side then, right? Like, given that this is a systemic issue that all American companies trying to enter the market must face, how can they? It helps decode the censorship. The censorship is also changing at all times. What was true of the censorship regime when Transformers 3 was coming out is no longer true today, and what's true today was no longer true like even 2 months ago. So it's constantly shifting. And if there was a way for there to be more transparency as to what those directives actually are, which often come down as oral directives or script notes, because a film that wants to shoot in China, even just shooting, has to go through government approvals of the script. Then again, it goes through like 2 or 3 levels of checks at each stage before it's even allowed, given the 许可证, the document that allows it to screen theatrically. So if at every stage we had, just a better sense of what they're looking for, I don't think at this stage we could. The film is now under the Propaganda Bureau since recently they elevated the level of state control over film in particular, not radio, not television, but film. And so there is film is going to play an increasingly large ideological role in the party's eyes. They see it as part of it's an ideological tool, and increasingly so. And so that I don't think there's any way other than like regime change to reverse that trend. But I guess what can be done on the US side is, just greater transparency and sharing of what those directives are, which would benefit creators so they know where the lines are, so that when they're trying to create content that can fit those strictures, that they would have a better sense. But I mean, that's pretty impossible also. I don't know how you do that because it's very much not in anyone's interest, financially or otherwise, from a PR perspective or really any perspective, A, to work together like that as an industry as a whole, and B, to share that information, unless there was truly so much political pressure, I guess, that there was something that could really bring the big studios together as a unit and decide that this was a good idea.
There's a question here from Richard Ward. Maybe Bethany, you might want to take this one. What about U.S. political pressure on Hollywood? As you mentioned, historically, there's always been anti-communist pressure, right? So pressure to, portray the USSR, Russia in a certain way. What are you seeing in terms of U.S. political pressure on Hollywood? This has been alluded to a bit, but I think you can take this.
Right. So we've seen some pretty high-profile GOP representatives and members of the House of Representatives calling out Hollywood. And in fact, I think it wasn't didn't Secretary of State Mike Pompeo actually call out Hollywood as well in a speech last year, I think? But we're seeing some different kinds of proposals to try to put a counter pressure on Hollywood. And one of them is, so in the US, a lot of obviously big blockbusters deal with military, themes, they're war movies or whatever. And in order to film those, a lot of, ideally they want to talk to US military consultants, or they want to, use some of the military resources. And in the past, the US military has used that in a way as a kind of its own censorship, that maybe we just won't grant those to you if it's for a film that, places the US military in a negative light. So the idea then is to use that connection with the Department of Defense as a kind of counter pressure, which is to say that if your film or your studio or something, if we see it as conceding to Chinese pressure, then we're not going to work with you. We're not going to give you access to these U.S. military resources. So this is just one of the proposals that's floating around out there. I mean, there's obviously, as James mentioned, concerns about, how do you respond to government pressure of one kind with government pressure of another kind. So, Anne Kokos, who is a professor of, I believe, media studies in the US, one of her points on this is that, we need to stay away from the impulse towards McCarthyism. And people in Hollywood are themselves very aware of this because this is their own history. During the Red Scare, during the early years of the Cold War, there was literally a Hollywood blacklist. People who were deemed had communist sympathies, and so there's a real fear there amongst people who write scripts, producers, all kinds of people in the film industry, that we might be seeing this kind of very, very clumsy and harmful counter pressure from some elements in American politics. We are far from that point, but that's a real concern that people have. It's a really tough issue. It's really hard because how do you deal with what is let's be clear, this isn't Chinese cultural pressure. This is Chinese government pressure. And it's, they've weaponized what's going to be the largest market in the world. They've weaponized the greed of Americans. How do you push back against that inside a liberal democracy in which one of our sort of core principles is that the government can't control what we say or how we spend money? It's really a difficult issue that we really haven't figured out a way to deal with.
I would just jump in again very briefly and say that one thing that could concretely be done but hasn't been done under the Trump administration is, film is actually, it's a trade issue, and that China, under its WTO obligations, is technically required to open up its market to American foreign product. And that actually in 2012, it was Vice President, it was Xi Jinping and Vice President Biden actually who signed an expansion of the Chinese quota system and expanded it to what it is now, which is technically, I think, 34 foreign import films that are allowed to come in, but that technically China does have obligations to open that quota up further, and talks that were apparently very close to being closed were then stalled when the actual trade war broke out, because it became about soybeans and other things, and obviously Trump is no friend to Hollywood, so he's not going to bat over on the film issue. But one thing that would be concrete to advocate for that would at least ease the censorship issue is the quota system, because if you're not so dependent on a few slots, you're not going to be tailoring your top most expensive products to fit those slots. So that would be something that is well within the American political spectrum of something that could be discussed, instead of this sort of culture war, only just this culture war on why are you censoring for Hollywood? Let's not make the three-body problem, etc.
Well, you took care of the next question, which was about the quotas, so thanks very much for that. I'm being told that we only have 2 more minutes, so I have to ask you guys the FCC mandated last question, which is, what books are you guys reading now? We asked that of all our speakers in COVID times to give our stuck-at-home members and audiences something to do. So books. What books are you reading?
I have 3. I usually am reading more than one book at once, but I have 3. So I'm reading Sean Roberts' The War on the Uyghurs, which I'll be doing a review of for Axios. And then I'm reading Outsourcing Empire, which is about how company states made the modern world. This is not a good way to understand Huawei, despite the authors having written an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal claiming that it was, but it is very interesting. And also Freedom's Battle by Gary Bass, The Origins of Humanitarian Intervention, a lot about slavery in here.
Very, very convenient show and tell, though. Very, very helpful for us.
Yeah, sure.
I don't have mine by my side, but I'm reading Jeremy Barmay's In the Red, which is about contemporary culture in China, and it's fantastic. He's just so well versed in everything. And also sort of in memorandum, reading David Graeber's The Utopia of Rules, which is really good. And it's just such a shame we lost him as a thinker, because wow.
I just finished a book called White Man's Game, written by journalist Stephanie Haynes, who basically reviews a conservation project in Mozambique, started by Greg Carr, who's a prominent philanthropist associated with several prominent institutions in the US. and kind of discusses the nitty-gritty and the controversy of large-scale conservation projects through that lens, and talks about, you know, oh, this is the narrative where we're saving the elephants, but here, if you look, you know, there's people living within or right outside the grounds that are affected by these conservation decisions. So that was particularly interesting. And then since it's early October, I'm doing the October Zelazny Challenge, which is rereading a chapter a night in One Day in a Lonesome October, which is an old fantasy classic from Roger Zelazny.
Very cool. Well, thank you guys so much. Really appreciate it. I know it's early for all of you. So yeah, extra thanks. And I hope you guys have great days ahead. Thank you so much. And thanks to our members and audience for tuning in as well. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks very much.